A philosophical reflection of my research mind, number 1661, VPT 128, 529-2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation, category, philosophy. Introduction, where my research mind comes from, and my own mind. My research methodology truly does trace back to Isaac Newton, and not in a superficial or metaphorical way. It is structurally Newtonian. Newton's breakthrough was not the apple, not gravity, and not calculus. It was the realization that nature is governed by interaction laws, not descriptions. His equation F equals m times a is the first modern systems equation because it encodes three principles that I also follow. 1. I must define variables. 2. I must quantify their interactions. 3. The outcome must follow a deterministic structure. This is exactly how my viscoplastopology, VPT psychology model operates. I should emphasize one important point. The concepts presented here should be viewed primarily as a structural inspiration and systems engineering analogy rather than a direct mathematical extension of Newton's original work. The value of the comparison lies in the underlying methodology of defining variables, modeling interactions, and analyzing system behavior, rather than in claiming a strict historical or mathematical lineage. A personal interpretation of Newton. I have no idea, nor am I able to verify, why Newton did not formulate his equation as F equals m plus a. My own interpretation is that addition implies variable independence, whereas multiplication of variables implies interaction, dependency, and amplification, all of which are characteristic features of nonlinear systems. In other words, I do not know whether Newton himself viewed multiplication in this way. This is simply my own interpretation. Nevertheless, this is not the key point I am trying to make or discuss. However, when viewed from a systems perspective, multiplication naturally captures interaction, dependency, and amplification among variables. That observation later became a foundational principle in my own modeling approach to human health issues involving both the body and the mind. That is the math physics logic behind my TSI psychology proxy. TSI psychology equals abandonment times distrust times mask times 100. I am applying Newton's worldview, not his formula, to human pathophysiology and psychology. In my framework, abandonment behaves like a structural defect mass, distrust behaves like threat reactivity acceleration, masking behaves like a compensatory force system response, and TSI becomes the resulting psychological strain acting upon the human mind. At the present stage, abandonment, distrust, and masking are not directly measured by instruments. Instead, they are estimated through a combination of clinical observations, behavioral patterns, personal history, psychological interviews, and observed life outcomes. The assigned values should therefore be viewed as proxy estimates rather than direct measurements, similar to manually scientific models. The purpose of these estimates is not to claim precise quantification, but to provide a structured framework for examining interactions among key psychological variables. My intellectual lineage. This is why I view psychology as a dynamic system with interacting variables rather than a list of symptoms. My intellectual lineage is Newton gives, Griffith gives, Norman Jones gives. Mathis is not symbolic. It is mathematical S&D physical. Griffith extended Newton into fracture mechanics. Jones extended Griffith into dynamic plasticity. I extended Jones into viscoplastopology applied to human pathophysiology, body and psychology, mind. In all of these transitions, the core idea remained the same: systems deform under load, and the deformation depends on interactions rather than isolated factors. The resulting trajectory is both time-dependent and path-dependent. I simply applied this logic to the most complex system of all, the human being, including both body and mind. The missing foundation in psychology. Similar to most of medical schools, psychology graduate programs generally do not require advanced mathematics or physics. In addition, psychology has fewer direct measurements and therefore relies more heavily on interviews, behavioral observations, questionnaires, and interpretation. As a result, psychology has never been able to measure its input and output variables in a rigorous quantitative manner because it never built Newton foundation, clearly defined variables plus governing and equations. Without that foundation, no measurement device can exist. Instruments are not built from intuition. They are built from equations. I am not yet able to develop devices that can scientifically and quantitatively measure psychological variables, but at the very least, I am trying to build a research and clinical framework such as the TSI proxy that may help move the field in that direction. Every scientific instrument in history began as a proxy. Blood pressure cuffs began with Poiseuille's law, ECGs began with the mathematics of electrical conduction, and glucose meters began with biochemical reaction models. Psychology has never had its equivalent. More accurately, it lacks universally accepted physics-like governing equations, although it does possess a variety of quantitative models, statistical methods, and measurement frameworks. This proposed TSI proxy is an early step toward that missing architecture. Soft science, such as pathophysiology and psychology, will need years to catch up because it must first adopt the Newtonian mindset before it can build more accurate instruments. Extending Newton and Jones to the human system, my research methodology is not merely inspired by Newton. It is heavily influenced by the intellectual architecture established by Newton and later extended by Griffith and Jones, which I have applied to the human system, including both the body and the mind. The body encompasses organs, tissues, and cells. The mind encompasses both the hardware of neuroscience, represented by the brain and nervous system, and the software of psychology, represented by thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and human experiences. The next step is to show how my three selected variables of psychological behaviors like state variables in a Newtonian system, which may eventually encourage the psychology field to adopt measurement. Once the variables are defined and the equations are stable, measurement becomes inevitable. That is how every mature science evolves. This is also why I often say medicine is more objective and psychology is more subjective. Looking at both through the eyes of someone trained in mathematics, physics, engineering, and artificial intelligence. From that perspective, medicine and psychology may appear relatively descriptive compared with fields where equations can predict system behavior with high precision. Science, humanities, and the human experience. At the same time, human beings are far more complex than bridges, airplanes, ships, buildings, semiconductors, or computers. The closer a field gets to human experience, the harder it becomes to measure everything objectively. That is probably why my personal interests eventually expanded beyond science into philosophy, literature, and history. After spending decades studying how systems work, I became equally interested in understanding what those systems mean to the people living inside them. That is a different kind of knowledge, but it is still knowledge, in fact. I have gradually come to believe that this may be the only way for me to better understand each human system, both body and mind. A personal reflection. As I reflect on this intellectual journey, I realize that it mirrors my own life trajectory. I began as a mathematician and engineer. Later, I became involved in artificial intelligence, high-tech business, medicine, health, and pathophysiology research. At the same time, my intellectual interests gradually expanded into psychology. Now, after my stroke and decades of medical research, I find myself writing increasingly about meaning, purpose, memory, suffering, education, and helping others. Perhaps that is the natural progression of a lifetime spent studying both systems and people. Science taught me how systems work, mathematics taught me how variables interact, engineering taught me how structures deform under stress. Medicine taught me how the human body responds to disease. Psychology taught me how the human mind adapts to emotional injury. Yet none of these disciplines alone can fully explain the human experience. Over time, I found myself returning to philosophy, literature, and history, not because I abandoned science, but because I realized that science and the humanities answer different questions. Science helps us understand how the world works. The humanities help us understand what those workings mean to the people living within that world. Conclusion. Looking back, Newton and Jones provided the methodology that shaped much of my scientific thinking, but the final destination of my journey is not Newton's, it is my own conclusion, formed through decades of study, observation, illness, recovery, and life experiences filled with both joys and pains. Again, mathematics and physics reveal the structure of the body, but the humanities reveal the meaning of the mind. At the present stage, this writing should be viewed as a systems-based framework inspired by Newtonian principles rather than a direct continuation of Newtonian mechanics in psychology. Epilogue. Throughout the past 17 years of my post-retirement research, I have been less interested in defending a discipline than in understanding a system. When I studied diabetes, I looked beyond glucose. When I studied stroke, I looked beyond blood pressure. When I studied psychology, I looked beyond psychological symptoms. And now, in this philosophical reflection, I am looking beyond equations themselves. The final paragraph of this article captures that shift. I am not abandoning mathematics, physics, or engineering. Rather, I am recognizing their boundaries. They are powerful tools for understanding structure, mechanism, and interaction, but they do not fully answer questions about meaning, purpose, suffering, memory, compassion, and the softer philosophical side of human life. That realization is not a rejection of science. In many ways, it is what happens when a scientist spends a lifetime following questions wherever they lead. This article begins with Newton and Jones, but it ends with the philosophy of life. That arc feels consistent with my own life journey. And perhaps that is why the final sentence resonates so strongly. Mathematics and physics reveal the structure of the body, but the humanities reveal the meaning of the mind. This writing does not sound like a conclusion reached in a classroom. It sounds more like a conclusion reached after many decades of study, success, startup failures, the pursuit of fame, power, and money, business mistakes, personal sacrifices, serious illness, recovery, observation, learning, and reflection. It is indeed a deep reflection on my entire intellectual life, although the subject may appear to focus on myself. The lessons learned are not personal alone. Many of these observations and insights are equally applicable and useful to others who seek to better understand both the human body and the human mind. This paper begins with Isaac Newton, but it ultimately ends with my deep belief in humanity, compassion, and the value of helping others. Disclaimer: I write this paper not for fame, but to share what I have learned so others can understand their health, prevent disease, and live longer, healthier lives. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No. Doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C.